My name is Robert Michalski. I'm with Thycotic. I'm old enough to be a fan of the rock band called Nirvana and a state of mind that goes by the same name. And I'm also old enough to not to be excited about marketing data. And the intent for this session today is really to guide you through all those fancy buzzwords that you can match for the privileged access management space and give you like a quick heads up what to expect, how to organize the project, and what kind of traps to avoid. So if somebody was unsure where we are in the tech session, right? And does anybody know who that guy is? No guesses? And why it's all his fault? Probably more important question. So this young gentleman is Fernando Corbado, and he was a PhD of physics at MIT, and he's the actual inventor of what we call passwords today. They call it differently at the time, but he's the inventor of password. And he admitted at his last years that passwords became nightmare. So he wasn't a really big fan of his invention. And why is that the case, really? So the old good days, I still remember, the password thing was very simple. Everybody has their own favorite word, right? Mine was Hakuna Matata. Why not, right? And then the bad security guys came in and they said, it cannot be that simple. We have to complicate it. So it cannot be like just Hakuna Matata. There has to be a capital letter in it, right? So we as people in our collective intelligence, we came up with the very same idea that, okay, so let's start Hakuna Matata with a capital letter, right? That's a perfect idea. And then when the bad guys came back again and said, no, that's not good enough. You have to be, it has to be more complex. Then again, our collective intelligence kicked in, and we thought that the best way to add a number and the number out of them all would be 1 and at the end of our favorite word, right? So that's Hakuna Matata 1. So eventually, when it got even more complicated, and the bad guys, the bad security guys, said, you have to come up with a special character. Again, we did all the same, so it turns out that everybody's favorite special character is an exclamation mark, and the best way to put it is at the end of the password, right? That sounds obvious. And this is a problem that is still existent. If we rely on passwords which are created this way and we just iterate the number at the end and so on, it will never be secure. So to put it in context, there are some good numbers on that. I like personally Mark Twain, and he said once upon a time that there are small lies, big lies, and statistics. So turning to statistics, at least we can see some trends, and obviously the password problem, credentials problem is on the rise, and this is really a low-hanging fruit for attackers to go after, so it's not gonna go any better. But as it turns out, always, there is some magic pill to swallow, a thing to sneeze in, or something that you can smoke, right? So for the end user market, it's called password managers. For enterprise market, there are a lot of fancy names for it. Like, it could be PIM, it could be PAM. So it's always privileged something at the end, right? And yeah, it can be also funny. With some Indian companies, they come up with some crazy combinations. But eventually it's pretty simple. So it's about what we call privilege count and what's our attack surface overall. So there are some usual suspects, I would say. So the operating system accounts are the ones, so obviously Unix, Linux root account is a good example, Windows account is a good example, but when you start thinking about it, let's take, for example, AWS root account. So this account is usually in the hands of procurement guys, not the technical guys. And the reason for that is that it is bad engineering from AWS because it's the only account that you can do billing with. Right? So it's in the hands of a business guy, not the technical guy. Yet, there is no technical means to limit the privileges of that high privilege account. So it turns out that those privileged accounts are in all various places and they are really difficult to control with. So the attack surface is pretty big, pretty significant, because it's not like, let's say, a very specific niche solution for attacker deception. We are really touching all the different places, all the different systems, sometimes things we don't even realize, like a script lying somewhere there on NFS storage that contains embedded password, right? And it is a privileged account. So it's a difficult problem to tackle with, and there are various approaches to that. I tried to combine what I have seen from my experience and from my colleagues' experience into something that I call privilege nirvana because of the reasons mentioned. And there are a couple of steps to it. And the very first phase, or something that we still see within the companies, is I call it analog phase or zero phase. But this is really about having passwords stored in spreadsheet, sometimes paper. We still meet companies that use physical safes and envelopes for password rotation. So this is very, I wouldn't say very often, but even if in a mature organization you will find a department or place in the organization that they still are very they are not advanced in that. Most of the companies that haven't implemented any privileged access solution fall into the second category, meaning that there is some vault in the organization, or multiple vaults more often, like KeePass might be, LastPass might be Bitwarden, might be things that are used by business people versus admins. Usually there is no rotation, but the password quality is much better, so no default passwords, they might be very complicated ones. So it's a step forward, but it's still very insecure. And the next step is really a cross line, and it's about two things from my experience. It's really about having an access control structure to the vault. So instead of, let's say, a flat KeePass database, to have access controls which are based on identity source, let's say Active Directory and security groups within it, or maybe some specific parameters that we grabbed from LDAP. And with that, to have a focused approach, meaning that there is a least privilege in the whole concept, that people only get access to what they're supposed to do versus getting access to everything. And the second thing, the probably even more crucial thing, is how we provide session isolation. How we isolate the end user, the admin user, from the target server. And this can be achieved in a very different means, and that's something that I'm going to spend a little more time in the lab, if it still works, or I'll just go with another language on that. So that's a very important part, and these two things come together. And then when we approach another phase of the project, the common suspects to implement, to configure, are auto-discovery, to discover privileged accounts out of different sources, again, usual suspects like Active Directory, not necessarily usual like cloud systems, so to gather accounts from AWS, or maybe get into that SQL database over there and fetch the account directly from there, onboard them into the system. Session monitoring or session recording and auditing is implemented in that phase. Sometimes it comes earlier, and from my consideration, this is actually a mistake, and I'll tell you later on why I think it is a mistake. And a very important part of that phase is to make passwords stronger, so to automatically rotate them in all different identity sources or local systems that are onboarded into PAM system. And lastly, it's all about automation. Automation starting with analytics and ending with DevOps environments. And analytics can mean different things to different people. It can be something very simple like search through metadata out of recorded sessions, or it could be a little bit more complicated like comparing peers from the same department and see how they act differently on different systems and come up with a score how much risk they potentially expose to the company. Could be something even more fancier. So one of the systems is able to monitor mouse movements, and I know an example of how this was triggered, that the guy broke his leg and he came back to your organization, and the system alerted because he saw a difference in how his arm was working. So imagine that it wasn't the same guy, but just the guy who was able to steal the credentials or take over the identity from this guy. So he would be probably acting very differently, right? So the system can catch that. And on the DevOps side of things, this is, I think, still a kind of black hole. Meaning that we don't have visibility in what's going on over there, and by all means we want to have that visibility, and we want to have a single throat to choke. So instead of like individual password managers, let's say in Kubernetes and other orchestration tools, I want to have a single vault. I want to audit all those things, and I want to automate them as well as much as possible. So this is again very important, underestimated at this stage, I think. But yeah, it's the state of nirvana. So it's the way it's a place where we will probably go into at some point in time. And with things that you want to do, there is always some caveats. There are always some gotchas. There are always some traps that you can fall into. And they have different categories. So from a business perspective, I think the biggest trap that you can probably fall into is to take a binary approach to the project implementation. So like all or nothing. And it's a really bad approach because the way it ends is always the same. The system is not adopted and it stays just as a vault. So it doesn't serve the purpose. And the same effect is often achieved with like underestimating the change that we inject or influence into organization with a PAM system, because it's not something that the user doesn't see, doesn't interact with. It changes the daily job, really. So the system has to be simple to be able to take that, and the users has to be trained to be able to use it effectively. On more technical side of things, imagine that the very same system that is used to protect human privileges is used for securing programmatic access. So being a former programmer, I can very easily imagine that there is this junior programmer which was selling apples in a grocery shop or whatever 2 years back, and right now he's writing code. And he can very easily create an infinite loop that will just flood the system with a large volume of API requests, right? So that can kill the system that is used by humans. So eventually, if somebody wants to kill the process that the guy created, they cannot get to the system because the human part of it is not responsive. So you can create a trap for yourself with that approach. So by all means, those systems has to be or should be separate. There is also this tiny little thing that we underestimate when we start the project implementation called reports, right? Why would I need reports? I mean, I just need to get this fancy stuff reports. Nobody's interested in reports. And then the other day, this CXO guy comes in and he asks for a bunch of reports, right? So what can I do if I don't have the answer for it? The data is there, because usually that's just a SQL database. Is there an easy way to move this data out and create something that answers the question that was asked? Yeah, it's an open question, and usually the answer is no. Yeah, by all means, that's something that requires a thoughtful process in the beginning, and it's important. And last one that I wanted to mention in here, that I touched based before, is that sometimes companies focus on very specific functionality, and we have seen that in Poland, that session recording at some point in time was a thing, right? We want to record all the sessions, right? That's the ultimate purpose, and they did that. Many companies acquired solutions for session recording, and then when they start to think, okay, so, but I mean, how do I get credentials in, and how can I extend that? So the answer from the vendor was, no, we just do session recording. I mean, yeah, maybe in 2 years, maybe in 5, we can start thinking about that, but they kind of locked into a solution that cannot address their needs. So even if the purpose is to focus on a single thing, or just tactically, think about the whole process, think about other things to avoid getting locked with a solution that does not scale, does not add functionalities on a regular basis. And one thing that I wanted to focus a little bit more deep is the session isolation thing, how it works, how it can be achieved, and what are some pros and cons of using different methods. Because I mean, again, I'm old enough to know that there is no silver bullet for the vampire. There is no such a thing in IT. Everything has their advantages and disadvantages, and also different models to do the session isolation falls into that category. And let me show you some of the things that you can do in the system, and hopefully that's going to just work. Oh, I'm surprised, it does work, okay? So first things first, right? What is the basic information that the system stores? I mean, you might think it's just password, right? And it's a good thinking, but realistically, it's a set of data. So this, I mean, you could say credentials, right? Just let me give you a quick example. So this is an admin account, Active Directory admin account, and it has some data attached to it, right? So there is a template for this type of account, and there is information about the domain and the username and the password. And the password thing is something that the user doesn't necessarily need to see, because we want to isolate the user from the password, and we want them to use the PAM solution versus like grabbing the password and logging into somewhere, right? So with that, they can simply view the password. Of course, that's something that is audited. We can see that in the audit log, we can make a report out of it, but it's inherently insecure approach. So the very same account, or the very same secret or credentials, depending on how you want to name it, when implemented properly, will look slightly different. There is username and domain name and everything, but there is no password in that case, right? So the user cannot grab the password. But still, they can use the system. So how does it work? They cannot log into the system outside of the PAM system control, So they have to go to that interface and they need to open the launcher. So the launcher is asking me where I want to connect to, since that's ID credentials. So I'm going to connect to my favorite domain controller. And let's go do that. And if we are lucky enough, I will get actually connected. If I'm lucky enough. Okay, so I'm connected to the system, and yeah, let's do this simple thing and look at some connection details. So this is, the connection is initiated from the machine name that ends with two nines, right? So that's this one. Actually close this one. And so that's the machine name that I initiated the connection, right? So with that, the connection is direct from the admin endpoint into the target server. And is it good or bad? I mean, it depends, right? I mean, ideally, I would like to have a network segmentation where I can very simply block access VLANs from server VLANs on the firewall and really prohibit that kind of access. There is even more important aspect to it. In that case, we actually need to send the credentials to the admin endpoints. And if the guy is skilled enough, he can get their hands on the credentials. It can be sometimes more complicated, so the guy has to grab the memory, go through some analysis and get that. Sometimes it can be very simple if we inject the credentials from the command line, so looking at the process details, it will be enough, right? But we send the credentials to the endpoint. That's inherently dangerous, so we want to avoid it. So what we can do about that? We can initiate that connection from a secure system, being a PAM system, over a proxy functionality. So let's go and look at different type of systems. So a Linux one this time, and let's go with this one. And do the same thing. So I will initiate the connection. And pay attention to the session while it starts, and you will notice the difference very quickly. Do you see the username over here, right? It's something that is not on the secret. So over here I have Aaron, and over there, this one, yeah, this one, it was something completely different. And the reason for that is that this username is a temporary username, or the obfuscated credentials, which are generated for the time being, and they are invalidated in the moment that the session is started. And eventually you can also see that this session was initiated against a SSH proxy, and the user gets connected to the target server. And right now, when we look at some details in here, we see that the connection in that case is initiated from the machine ending with 31, and that's not 99 that we've seen before. So that's actually the SSH proxy that was initiating that that connection. So that's good. We don't send the credentials to the endpoint, so there's no way to grab them. We still have a very good scalability because we are using the endpoint resources of admin station, and we just need to bump to side of the TCP connection, which is not super resource intensive. So it's a good balance between security and visibility and the cost of that approach, right? Specifically for Linux users, Linux fans, they don't like, for some reason, to log into a PAM system. They want to access the system directly. right? So how can they do that? They can use the credentials that we, sorry, not this one, generate on the fly. So if they wanted to do that desperately, they could grab those temporary credentials on the fly from via a call, so just a simple REST API call, and use them, right? And the moment they use them, they are invalidated. So again, we have good security in place. But it's not super usable. So there is another way to do that. We can use the terminal server that we have in place. And I thought I had that open, but I'll take that. Do it again, so give me a chance to log in. Okay, so I'm on my Ubuntu laptop, and so how do I get connected to the target server then? So, yeah, I do. So look at this this single liner. So what we have here is that this is my identity, identity from the PAM system, right? And usually that's something coming really from Active Directory. So I authenticate against Active Directory in that case. This could come with multi-factor authentication as well. Then I point to the IP address of the PAM system. Then I need to specify what credentials I want to use. So this is the secret identifier, and then eventually the machine that I want to connect to with those credentials. So let's go and do that quickly. And all there, here we are. Yeah. So we are on the target server with that. And you can use this functionality in a slightly different variation as well. So I escaped the shell, and right now I'm on the terminal server. So that's really a restricted shell. And from here I can search for some secrets. So let's go search for Thycotic. And yeah, let's go connect to this one. So I will initiate a session. And I should get connected soon. And indeed, I got connected. There is a notification in the meantime that was displayed that the session is being recorded. So with that, we have all the controls that we have in place. The user doesn't need to go into a fancy web interface. They get connected immediately to the right place. And these are the two that are, or these are the most popular things that the users want to, the companies want to have in place to cover all various scenarios. But I don't know a single implementation when there was no something unusual in the project scope. And unusual, maybe it's a too big word for that, but what I really mean is something that has to be customized on, not this one, on the fly. So what we have in here is a launcher for FileZilla client, and FileZilla using FTP, so insecure version. So anybody who was able to sniff in the traffic would be able to grab the password. So with that launcher, what actually happens is that we tunnel the insecure protocol, FTP in that case, into SSH. So we make it secure, and the session is targeted against local random parameters. Loopback interface and just random port number. And with that, we get connected to the target server with FileZilla, and the session can be recorded as anything else. If we have a launcher in the system, if we create a launcher in the system, we can record the session out of it. So good stuff. And another thing that on the launching or the way you can get session isolation is through Junboxing. And that's very interesting on how this differs from proxy-based approach. So I go to the launcher, and right now, instead of getting connected directly, what I get is an RDP file, right? So I can interpret that RDP file in my favorite tool, open with it, and what's happening right now behind the scenes is that there is the program, in that case, since that's RDP session, it's RDP client launch in a Junbox, and we get a visual representation of what is happening in the Junbox server. And this is the original approach to session isolation that was proposed by Cyber, right? And it's still a good approach, I think, but it's not universal in terms that it comes with disadvantages. The advantage of that model is that we don't send the credentials to the endpoint, not even temporary ones. It's all in the Junbox server, right? So nobody can get those credentials out. Yet this creates a huge need for resources. So every session means additional resources on the target server, and eventually you end up with multiple, sometimes dozens of servers just for this specific task, and you have to maintain them and so on and so on. So you have to be able to balance that, right? And mix and match what makes most sense from security perspective, from usability perspective, and just use the different means for different types of people or different tasks to handle. And last thing I wanted to show over here is to kill two birds with one stone. The cloud is mentioned today multiple times, and as much as all security guys want to avoid that, it's there, and we have to live with that. So cloud comes with multiple ways to access it. The two common ones is really a web interface, and then there is usually some CLI way to access the system. So let's go start with the latter option. So in that case, the system will call PowerShell on the user endpoint, and then we can use a specific commandlet to authenticate to get the context of a specific tenant and the user, right? So now I'm authenticated. Actually, I used AZ login in that case, but you can use any commandlet that you want. And I'm authenticated. The session is recorded, can be previewed live while it's happening, and we get all the controls. But it does not fundamentally. It's not fundamentally different from what we have seen before on the custom launcher things that we can create on demand. Web password filler is a different approach that we haven't seen before. So in that case, we have a plugin into the web browser. That's the one that is here, and it simply injects the credentials into the user session. So it acts similarly to LastPass and the other guys that you can think about it. The difference is that this guy can also record a session. So you get, again, full audit of what was happening, and it can cover business applications, system appliances like, let's say, proxies, firewalls, etc. Everything that has a web interface. So different ways. Important is that to be able to balance the security thing, usability thing, use of resources, how much of pain it creates versus problems it solves, and just to be reasonable about it, assuming that there is no perfect solution that fits all needs, and we just need to be smart about it, I would say. Lastly, I wanted to say a few words about the company I work for, Thycotic. So we are one of the leaders in the privileged access management space. You can take different reports. I just picked random one. It's Kuppinger Coil in that case. We are leaders in all of them. And funny thing is that there is actually two companies in the leader quadrant of Gartner, and in here, as you can see, that merge together, Thycotic and Centrify. So we are now a combined one beast. And I don't recall from my 20+ experience that a moment where two Magic Quadrant leaders would come together, and we did that. And right now we have a very complete portfolio of products to really look at privileged access management from all various angles that you can imagine, starting with traditional human access through dynamic privilege escalation, ending with machines talking to machines, and how much visibility and control we can get out of it. And lastly, there is plenty of good resources that we share with the community that you can use, starting with free of charge version of Secret Server that is available for up to 10 users. So you can onboard your family into Secret Server and give them a secure access to passwords, right? And there are some tools for discovery that you can use. There is also a document that goes about maturity model, and you can measure yourself against different factors. So the version that I gave you today, I mean, a couple of minutes before, is a little bit simplified or focused on my view of things. The one that's over there is more complete. So you can do the self-assessment, we can do it together if you'd like to, and you can find out where you are comparing to metrics of other companies and really try to act on that. And with that, I will open to questions if there are any. No questions?
Actually, a short one. What are your thoughts on the passwordless authentication that Microsoft released like a few weeks ago to the public?
I have no idea how it works.
You know, only the second factor is used for the authentication, basically.
Yeah, well, I read how this is supposed to work, and I still don't get it. So that's I don't know. How did yeah? But I think overall, the problem we have with passwords is a sort of primary one, right? I don't think that there is easy way out of it. When I was at the university, my second degree was about biometric authentication, not the one that you would assume like an eye or a fingerprint. It was actually your ear, which has very specific way how it's structured, and it's very easy to do it. But imagine how many people want to do that to the machine. Nobody. And we need usability problems and how to balance all those things all together and finding the right solution for the time being, really, being realistic.
What do you think about USB keys as a replacement for using the password?
I would never assume that there would be enough to replace passwords, and they're just the same thing, but delivered in a different way. It's like cloud versus on-prem. So cloud is just somebody else's computer that we are not directly responsible for, and that's a similar thing over in here. We just move that, it's just a different way to consume the same problem. And so I think that it's overall it's not a solution that we are looking into. Sorry to disappoint you. On that. Okay, any more questions, guys? Thoughts? Doubts? Comments?
Maybe later.
Maybe later. Okay, I come to it. Okay, so thank you guys so much.